Cook.
Good afternoon and welcome to Politics in the Pulpit here on your hometown station, AM 1220 and 98.1 FM. This is your holy host, the Bishop of Santa Clarita, back for another opportunity to talk about the two things that we're not supposed to talk about in public, religion and politics, and yes, they indeed mix. Well, happy early Thanksgiving to all of you out there. We kind of start off with some conflicting news from Washington, D.C. About 2 hours ago, there was news that an active shooter was live in Washington, D.C., and two National Guardsmen were shot and were in critical condition. And then about 30 minutes ago, there were reports from West Virginia Governor Patrick Morrisey that both of those National Guardsmen troops had lost their lives due to their injury, and there is a suspect in custody. But now we're getting reports that perhaps maybe the National Guardsmen are not dead. So I don't know what's going on. You would think that they would have been very, very careful about vetting that information before the governor of West Virginia would tweet that out. But just getting news now that the two National Guardsmen that were shot just literally a mile or so from the White House are either in critical condition, which is true, or they have succumbed to their injuries. So just keep an eye out for the news on that. I also got news that the suspect is in custody. We have absolutely no idea as to why these National Guardsmen were shot. Let's just hope that politics is not involved here. So if you would, keep those two guardsmen in your prayers. One of the things I wanted to talk about today, several things actually. One of the first things we're going to talk about is, can a Republican win the governor's mansion here in California? It might be a bit of an early Thanksgiving gift here for me to kind of speculate about this, but in just a few moments I want to kind of go through some of the trend lines and the numbers that we're seeing that actually could work out in the Republicans' favor and backfire on the Democrats. And in this particular case, maybe this whole jungle primary that was implemented several years ago, which frankly I don't like, maybe the jungle primary might actually work to the Republicans' advantage this time around. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Also, at the bottom of the hour, I wanted to talk a little bit about the true Thanksgiving and kind of talk a little bit about the historicity of Thanksgiving, why we celebrate it, and also to take some of the politics out of Thanksgiving that unfortunately gets injected into it wittingly or unwittingly. And so we'll talk about that at the bottom of the hour. And also, as we come to the very last section of the show today, I wanted to play a lengthy speech from former President Ronald Reagan from his 1986 Thanksgiving address. There's always something very warm and very cozy about hearing Ronald Reagan's voice. And so it'll be apropos, I think, today to go out on this final show of November and the show just before Thanksgiving, hearing one of the greatest presidents of the 20th century, if not the greatest president of the 20th century. Before we get into speculating as to whether or not a Republican might be able to win the governor's mansion, if you are in Tennessee, you might want to get out and vote this coming Tuesday. That's December 2nd. The race is to fill the seat of retiring GOP Representative Mark Green, who left Washington, D.C. earlier this year for a job in the private sector, and Republican Matt Van Epps, who is also a veteran and also a commissioner of the Tennessee Department of General Services, is going against a Democrat by the name of Afton Bain, who, according to her own words, is the Nashville-hating state representative who's been dubbed the AOC of Tennessee. And so this should be an easy seat for Republicans to win. According to the polls from last year, President Trump won this district by 22 points. Again, this is the Tennessee 7th Congressional District, and this is a special election. However, an Emerson poll came out just yesterday that suggests that Matt Van Epps, the Republican, is up by 49.4%, and Afton Bain, the AOC of Tennessee, the aforementioned hater of Nashville, has 47% with a 3.5% air in either direction. Now, again, I don't know if this is a trash poll. It probably is. It probably is, folks. This is kind of like, what the week before the election in 2024, and there was the Seltzer poll that came out saying that Kamala Harris was going to win Iowa by, was up by 3 in Iowa or something like that, and that was just one of those candy polls to get the Democrats all excited about their candidate, which of course didn't work because Trump obviously won Iowa going away, and Seltzer ended up retiring completely. And this might be something very much like that. I do think that Matt Van Epps is going to win next week, but that doesn't mean that Republicans and Republican-leaning independents should sit this one out. So get out there and vote there in that special election for Tennessee number 7. Now, the other thing that happened this week is Democrat Eric Swalwell here in California joins a crowded California governor's race to succeed Gavin Newsom. Now, for a while I was thinking, why in the world did Eric Swalwell decide to jump into the race for California governor? Why in the world would Eric Swalwell think that he has the wherewithal? Why would he think he has the appeal statewide to be able to run a successful campaign? Well, unfortunately, Eric Swalwell is also very virulently anti-Trump. I'm going to read a little bit here from the Cal Matters. Representative Eric Swalwell, a former Democratic presidential candidate, if you remember that in 2020, who helped lead the second impeachment of President Donald Trump, has officially entered the fray to succeed California Governor Gavin Newsom in next year's gubernatorial race. His core message? Prices are too high and people are scared. And I'm assuming that latter part would be the ICE raids that are happening here and across the country. Swalwell, who is 45, a prominent Trump antagonist on social media and cable news darling, who ran a short-lived bid for the White House in 2019, made the announcement Thursday night at the tail end of a nearly 10-minute interview with late-night host Jimmy Kimmel. And by the way, if you watch that interview, he actually said that California was the greatest country in the world. I'm sure that was a verbal faux pas, but on the other hand, maybe it wasn't. The problem that I think is going to happen here is there is a crowded field already with the Republicans, not with the Republicans, with the Democrats. And there are several Democrats that are vying to take over Democrat Newsom's seat. And so what I think is going to happen here is there's going to be a coalescing around one Democratic name because there are so many Democrats running that they risk splitting the vote, and then whether they like it or not, they're going to end up propelling at either one Republican or two Republicans into the top two going into November of 2026. Now, the reason why I think what's going to end up happening is people are going to now start coalescing around Eric Swalwell is because Eric Swalwell is not only anti-Trump, but he is going to, I believe he has some sort of, I think the government or the Trump administration is going after Swalwell, and I think that Swalwell is going to use that in the same way that Gavin Newsom used the anti-Trump sentiment to propel Proposition 50. And so you'll notice that one of the rich Democrats that was running for the Democratic nominee here in California actually just jumped out of the race yesterday and endorsed Eric Swalwell, and that means a bunch of money. And I do think over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to start seeing that happening. However, is there a possibility that Republicans could actually either be in the top two, which I think the fact that they would be in the top two, I think is more likely now than not. But can they win the governor's race? That is the question. Well, according to this article, Californians are craving real leadership after 8 years of Newsom's posturing and primping, while so many are suffering. A new way forward begins November of 2026 when Bianco says, "I am elected." Newsweek reached out to the campaigns of former Democratic Representative Katie Porter, Republican candidate Steve Hilton, and former Democrat Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa about the new survey results. Now, this is an interesting survey. I'm going to read some of the latest on this. Latest polling was conducted by Democratic pollster Ben Tolkien on behalf of Villaraigosa's campaign. It showed 4 candidates in close contention, but Bianco in this poll, who has been the sheriff of Riverside County since 2019, came out on top with a very slim lead. Bianco, a supporter of President Donald Trump, had the highest level of support in the survey at 20%. Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of Los Angeles, came in second at 19%. And by the way, this was conducted by Democratic pollster on behalf of Villaraigosa's campaign. So it's interesting that Villaraigosa came in second here. And then GOP candidate Steve Hilton came in at 18%, and then Katie Porter was fourth with 15%. And then there were a bunch of underling candidates below Porter, all in the single digits. Now, there's another poll that came out showing that Steve Hilton is leading. Now, what's interesting is what we're noticing is no Democrat has led any of these polls since early October. Now, before October, Katie Porter was, I wouldn't say going away with it, but she was leading. Nobody was leading with a huge margin, just that Katie Porter was leading. Then all this negative news came out about Katie Porter, not being able to keep her temper, the story about her taking the boiling potatoes and taking them off the stove, pouring it over her ex-husband's head in front of her children. Probably didn't sit well with a lot of voters in California. And then, of course, there was that viral moment where she basically told one of her staffers who got in the way of her camera angle, and she said something like, get the F out of my shot. And so people saw that, and they also remember the CBS interview where she refused to answer some follow-up questions, and she got very disgruntled at a CBS reporter. And ever since then, a barrage of things have come out, and Katie Porter's numbers have started to crater, and more of these polls are coming out with either Sheriff Chad Bianco or Steve Hilton leading. Now, here's what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking, and I can confidently say this, I believe, that as of the primary in June of 2026, I do believe that there will be at least one Republican in the top two. I don't know whether to be Steve Hilton or Sheriff Chad Bianco. I know which of the two I would much rather have. But the fact is, it's going to be one of those two. Is it going to be against Porter? Probably not. Is it going to be against Tom Steyer, who just, dropped his campaign a couple days ago? He's the billionaire that ran unsuccessfully for president back in 2019, who, by the way, if you hear his campaign infomercial, sounds an awful lot like Gavin Newsom. I don't know if that was an AI thing or that was really his voice, but anyway, sounds an awful lot like Gavin Newsom. He just threw his hat in the ring. My guess is Tom Steyer is going to run for a little bit throughout the December month, throughout Christmas. Right after Christmas, we'll probably end up stopping and then throwing his support and his money, more than likely, behind Eric Swalwell. I really think Eric Swalwell is going to be the Democratic darling that California Democrats are going to get behind. And that's because they want to ride an anti-Trump sentiment for the White House. Now, let me also mention that because all these Democrats are still in the race, like former U.S. Health Security Secretary Javier Becerra and Antonio Rivera and other what I would consider non-entities, because all of them are in the race and are getting anywhere between 2 to 3 to 4% of the vote, it's very likely that that support splits in such a random direction that it may, I'm not saying this is a guarantee, but it may propel 2 Republicans to the top tier. Can you imagine if 2 Republicans, Chad Bianco and Steve Hilton, end up in the top 2 in the June primaries? If that happens, I promise you within 24 to 48 hours, the Democrats here in California will move to get rid of the jungle primary and go back to what we had prior to that. In fact, it might be the quickest way to get rid of the jungle primary, which of course I don't like, but this might be the best way to get rid of it. So my theory is that because the Democrats, they've got too many people running and all of their allegiances are split at the moment, this is allowing Steve Hilton and Sheriff Chad Bianco to maybe sneak into either one of the 2 in the June primary, or perhaps even make them both in the top 2. And then finally in California, it is very possible at that point now that we actually have a Republican governor. Now, some people would probably say, I don't think that's going to happen. They are going to realize this. They can read the tea leaves just as well as a guy on KHTS hometown station can. And the Democrats are going to get behind Eric Swalwell. No, I'm with you. I'm trending with you there. There's no doubt that after Christmas, there is going to be a barrage of support for Eric Swalwell. He's young, 45. He looks like a Ken doll. And of course, if he does end up being the main Democratic candidate, then of course all is well when it comes to campaigning, because we're going to have to bring out the whole Chinese affair and the Fang Fang and the Bang Bang and all that kind of stuff that happened with him. And so that'll be a lot of fun going into the 2026 campaign. Hopefully, whichever Republican ends up in the top 2 with him will use all of that to their advantage. So that's my thoughts. We'll see what happens. But in the least, we can at least see a Republican in the top 2. If my theory pans out, then perhaps we might actually see 2 Republicans in the top 2. Let's see what happens. When we return here on your hometown station, I want to focus a little bit on the traditional Thanksgiving that we celebrate here in America and why it's a good thing when we return on your hometown station. We're back here, Politics in the Pulpit here on your hometown station. I wanted to talk a little bit about Thanksgiving and just how unique Thanksgiving is, not just for people around the world who celebrate it a little bit differently, but the uniqueness of Thanksgiving here to the United States of America. And obviously, all the historical revisionists try to attack everything that happens here in the United States. And I think it's important for me to say right at the outset, America is not a perfect country. America doesn't have perfect people in it. We're all sinners. I think that's pretty clear. And I'm not saying that everything about our history is perfect either. However, I still wouldn't trade our country for another. And so what I wanted to talk about for the next few moments is about the first Thanksgiving and using that as the premise for why we celebrate Thanksgiving today. I remember when I was in school, I had the privilege of going to a private school because my dad, who was a Tennessee redneck who never went past the third grade, who, by the way, ended up being a successful truck driver for many years. He and his brother owned a trucking company for almost 30 years, and so for a guy that never went past the third or fourth grade, ended up being pretty successful. Nevertheless, because he never really had much of an education, he wanted to make sure that I did, and so because he was successful, he put me into private school. And when I was in private school, I was taught a pretty decent analysis of American history. And there are some today who are revisionists who would say that the National Day of Thanksgiving should be changed to a National Day of Mourning because the Pilgrims killed and oppressed the natives. Now, I think it's important for us to understand that Pilgrims and natives both had warring factions. We just can't say the Pilgrims killed and oppressed the natives because that isn't totally true. It's also very true that the natives were warring with each other. Various native groups were warring with each other. There were land conciliations and mass extinctions of whole native groups by native groups. And I think that needs to be mentioned as well. And that's because we're all sinners and we're all fallen short. And unfortunately, that stuff happens. But sadly, many modern portrayals of the Pilgrims are at best superficial. Too often they reflect a trend by some in academia of attacking and vilifying traditional American heroes, presenting a picture quite different from what actually occurred. And in each of these cases, if we talk about the Pilgrims and the Native Americans back in the late 1600s, there were three main issues that surrounded that first Thanksgiving. There was the 1623 initial clash between the natives and the Pilgrims. There was the Pequot War of 1637, and then there was the King Philip's War of 1675, which was years later. Now, in each of these, no doubt, natives and Pilgrims clashed. There's no doubt about it. Both sides were killed, but was this the norm? And does history bear out these kinds of conflicts? And was this the norm between natives and the Pilgrims? And I would suggest to you, I don't think this was the norm. Now, what about the Pilgrims? What about Chief Massasoit and Squanto? I'm sure you've probably heard about those three Native Americans when you were in grade school and high school, Chief Massasoit and Squanto. When the Pilgrims first arrived to form a new colony in Massachusetts, it was at the onset of winter, arriving with practically the clothes on their backs, with no dwellings and no knowledge of the land in general. Remember, this was virgin territory to them. Of the 100 or so people who originally set out on the Mayflower, more than half of them died that first winter. The next spring, the Mayflower returned to England, but not even one of the surviving Pilgrims chose to go back. They all stayed because they had not come for personal convenience nor for monetary reward. Why did they come? Well, they came for religious and civil liberty and to become what they called stepping stones for others to follow after them and do the same. It was in that spring that the Pilgrims had their first encounter with the natives, not in a negative way. Enter Samoset and Chief Massasoit and Squanto. While two of the natives spoke broken English, it was Squanto who actually spoke fluent English. And by the way, Squanto was a slave, and I believe he was set free by Catholic friars, and then was sent back to Britain, and I think was actually an interpreter for some British regalia. But through Squanto's help, the Pilgrims learned the art of husbandry, which is farming in the New World. For the second winter, the Pilgrims were much better prepared, and things looked much better than had the preceding year when half of the colonists had died. And it was then that Governor William Bradford therefore appointed a day of Thanksgiving. This was the first official appointed day of Thanksgiving without any national government, obviously. There was no national government in the United States until 1776, and it was, of course, President George Washington who gave the first national proclamation for Thanksgiving. But Governor William Bradford, coming over on the Mayflower, appointed a day of Thanksgiving, for they had much to be thankful for. They now had a place where they could freely worship God. They had food in their bellies, thanks to these natives who came at the right time, and all with the help of Squanto and Chief Massasoit. And so this first Thanksgiving was proclaimed. They were grateful to their blessings. The Pilgrims invited their native friends to celebrate and to give thanks to God with them. Chief Massasoit and 90 of his men feasted with the remaining Pilgrims who had survived that second year. That abundant feast, by the way, did not have turkeys and all that other wonderful stuff that we think of, but it had deer, fish, lobster, eels, cornbread, various herbs, berries, and pies. Kind of like a traditional Thanksgiving, but not quite. Afterwards, they engaged in athletic competitions with the natives, including running, wrestling, and shooting. Chief Massasoit and his men enjoyed themselves so much, they stayed for 3 whole days. And by the way, this is why so many of you like to watch the national football game on Thanksgiving or the day after, because that's where that tradition comes from. To this day, that tradition of feasting and athletics continues to this very day. Now, that first Thanksgiving between the Pilgrims and the natives, I believe, debunks the narrative that is trying to be forced on this. The revisionist narrative states that the natives loathed the Pilgrims because of their land-grabbing practices and general racist disdain for natives. But if the account of the first Thanksgiving is true, which, again, I've taken from several sources, then the revisionist allegations are both illogical and completely unfounded. Now, I want you to think about it. The 53 remaining Pilgrims were comprised of 4 women, 14 young boys and girls, and only 22 men. On the other hand, the 90 natives were all warriors. If there had been any ill will, the natives could have eliminated the Pilgrims in a matter of minutes, but they didn't. You say, why? Because they were friends and had gained a mutual respect and trust between them. Now, when I say friends, I don't mean like, best buds, but they had helped them survive that second winter. And so they had a respect for them, and I think the natives, in turn, had respect for the Pilgrims. So again, there were 53 Pilgrims that were comprised of 4 women, 14 young boys and girls, and only 22 men. 90 native warriors could have easily taken them all out, but they didn't. So, what about the claim that the Pilgrims were a bunch of land grabbers? Well, because the Pilgrims were Christians, they believed and practiced the principle of thou shalt not steal, which I think is a good principle for everyone to participate. The Pilgrims purchased much of their land from the natives at a mutually agreed upon price. This policy of buying land from natives came to characterize the general practice of New England and portions of the mid-Atlantic colonies, which was mirrored by the Puritans in Rhode Island and in other parts of the New World. To this day, the longest peace agreement signed was between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians, signed on April 1st, 1621. And that agreement stated this, quote, agreeing to do no harm to each other, to come to each other's aid if attacked by third parties, and to have equal jurisdiction over offenders. This treaty was honored for over 50 years. Now again, as I said at the outset, accurate history is important when it comes to Thanksgiving. This account of the Pilgrims and the natives is just one more proof of God's providential hand in the founding of our nation. Now just think about what would have happened if those remaining 53 pilgrims who survived that first winter were to have left for England on the Mayflower that next spring. However, but because they stayed, despite the bitter hardships, God providentially moved in the lives of three natives, Chief Massasoit, Squanto, and Samoset, to enter the equation to give the Pilgrims the tools they needed to survive and thrive in what would be, not too long after, the United States of America. The Continental Congress declared the first national Thanksgiving on December 18th, 1777, and then, in 1789, President George Washington declared the last Thursday in November a national day of Thanksgiving. That is our Thanksgiving history. It is a combination of Puritan Protestant pilgrims and Native Americans who had a mutual respect for each other. Now, does this mean that there were natives that fought with other natives? Of course. There were land disputes, native upon native, even pilgrim with natives. I'm not disputing that there wasn't some ugliness in some of this. But towards the end, when Chief Massasoit, Squanto, when they came into the equation, this was a different situation. And folks, what I don't want you to do is to think to yourself, well, because it was so ugly, it was only ugly for a very brief time. Everything is ugly when it comes to sin, folks. Nobody's perfect. The natives weren't perfect. The pilgrims weren't perfect. When you have warring factions, war is ugly. Battles are ugly. What natives did to other natives was ugly. What some of the early pilgrims did to some of the natives was ugly. But the fact of the matter is, it all worked out. They were able to have a mutual respect for each other, and Governor William Bradford orders that first proclamation of Thanksgiving. So this Thursday, tomorrow, as many of you gather around, I hope and pray, a table full of bounty. Probably not eels and cornbread, but turkey, ham, what have you. I hope you can be thankful for those that are around the table, the things that are on the table, the nation that you live in, the form of government that we have here, even though we may not always like who's the commander-in-chief. I would much rather take the commander-in-chief of this country, no matter which party, over any other nation in the world. And you may thank the Lord for the United States of America, who I believe providentially put in place what we see today. And next year, we'll celebrate 250 years as a nation. Lots to be thankful for. When we return here on your hometown station, I wanted to play a 5-minute speech that former Ronald Reagan gave just prior to the Thanksgiving of 1986. When you hear Reagan's voice, perhaps you feel like me. You feel like you're just putting on a very comfortable old sweater that you just don't want to get rid of. And Reagan, because of 50 years in Hollywood and multiple movies. He just had a way of communicating, hence he's called the great communicator. And so as we enter the Thanksgiving holiday, I want you to listen to the words of Ronald Reagan when we return on your hometown station. All right, here we are in our final segment on Politics in the Pulpit. Again, here at the hometown station, we want to wish all of you a happy Thanksgiving. Tomorrow, hopefully, you will have, again, as I mentioned aforetime, a table full of stuff to partake of, and hopefully the family and friends that you have over, well, hopefully you're thankful for them too, even though sometimes they can get on our nerves, no doubt about it. I want to leave this final radio show of November with a speech from former President Ronald Reagan. This was a speech given in 1986, and it's not as overtly religious as some of his speeches have been concerning Thanksgiving, but I do believe that what he says here is quite appropriate. So listen to former President Ronald Reagan, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving out there from your hometown station.